we're going to welcome back Z and Kendall. And the idea here is I'm going to just kind of be quiet and sit in the background. And it's you guys, hopefully from seeing each other's talks and questions, you have questions for each other. And it's to try and get a conversation flowing. So does anybody have a question to start, or will I put somebody on the spot?
I can start, actually. I don't have a question, but I have a comment. So Kendall, everything you said about user research, our product team, applies to design operations. Everything you said. I thought that was really...
I was going to add a comment to say that I don't think our teams could run without design operations, that it really is that tool that, like you said, not a lot of teams know that they're doing it, but they're already doing it. And then once you actually apply the process to it, you're like, how did we live so long without it? So yeah, a lot of everything you mentioned resonated as well. I did have a question actually for Homer. So one of the things that your talk got me thinking about was, I took this remote exercise, or brought it, I guess, remote. And that can be a limiting factor for the participants that I'm able to test with. So I'm curious if you've seen any tools or unique ways of making sure that you're able to bring accessibility into research and make sure that even the way that you're researching is accessible.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that my team and I are doing right now, we're going through usability studies with our current application, and basically just looking for insight into how individuals who use assistive tech are actually, navigating through our products. And it kind of goes back to something that you mentioned earlier, where you said that all your participants were coming up with the same type of UI. They kept doing the same type of design. And that points back to when we are building out our applications, it's one thing to, like I said, to be innovative and things like that. And I had a quote in there from Jacob Nielsen about how individuals spend more time on other people's products and build those mental models about how your product should, or how a product or interface should actually work. And then they come back and they expect your product to do the same thing. Well, when we do these usability studies, we actually see that through the user testing that we do. So we get all the nice little data chunks and the feedback in pretty much the same way, and those human insights as to how they actually will use it. Then at the same time, myself and my team, those of us who are trained in ADA, we also provide the same insights, because accessibility updates don't just benefit individuals with disabilities, it also benefits the rest of us as well. So how does it affect our user experience when we're going through it? So those are the different things that we look for when we're doing our, individual studies and looking at the UX patterns inside of our applications.
I have a follow-up question on your comments there. You're talking about you go out to testing with real users and everything. And our team, where I've seen a lot of teams run into a budget issue, we don't have the opportunity to really reach out to the group of people, or just even reach out to the panel members and everything. What would be your suggestion, and the teams can go about to reach out to the real people, real user?
Honestly, you can start with your team. Every computer that we use has accessibility software built into it. So if you're on a Mac, you have VoiceOver. VoiceOver is a screen reader. If you can test your applications using VoiceOver to get an idea of how users would actually interact with your application that way, that's just fine. You don't have to have a super large panel of people, going through and testing your application. Is that great? Yes, it is, because obviously your sample size is larger, and then you also get a larger number of usability feedback about how your app actually works for people who have different modes of input. But for small teams, Start with what you have. Start with what you have. We already know it's really not feasible to even try to attempt to test with against every permutation out there. You just can't. Screen sizes. I mean, think back to when we started building responsive websites. You know, there was no way in the world we were actually going to be able to guess everyone's form factor straight out the gate. So we just had to allow, you know, responsive to do exactly what it was going to do and then test based on that. Same thing with accessibility. You already have the basic tools, like I said, screen readers, VoiceOver on Mac, you have Narrator on Windows, or you can download JAWS or NVDA, which is an open source screen reader for Windows, and begin those tests. The other thing that's great to test with, your keyboard. Your keyboard alone will show you so many different issues from a usability perspective with your application than you know. Because if you start to just one thing, go to your application and press the tab key and see where you are. As you're pressing the tab key, look to see if you can find yourself or find where you are inside your UI. If you can't, then that means that no one else can. Not just people with disabilities. No one can figure out where they are. So if they don't use a mouse and all they use is a keyboard, that's an issue that you can fix. The other thing is it shows you where you have keyboard traps. So when someone is using a keyboard and they are actually trying to use your application, wherever they get stuck, that's a keyboard trap that prevents them from moving forward. So those are some really low entry ways of testing that have a large impact. And then there's also the browser plugins that you can use. My favorite, I like to use Axe from DQ. Install the plugin, run an automated test. Manual testing and automated testing go great together. Manual testing really shows, you know, how the human is actually going to interact. The manual testing catches things from a programmatic standpoint. You can write code to test against these things. So I would recommend doing both of those, but low cost, low barrier to entry, but high impact. We can't hear you, Rory.
Apologies. I'm just saying, I'm going to jump in because on Design Ops, Kendall, you mentioned that you have a lot of support there. Is there anything you can share? What kind of tools or support are you provided with that help you do your role?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just the organization. I mean, I really look at our Design Ops partners as the ones who kind of see everything. They know what's happening in the rooms that I'm not in. They maybe don't know the same depth that I would know if I was in that room, but they're able to look across everything and say, they're actually able to pull me into the rooms that I need to be in and say, hey, we need you over here. There's this work that's happening. So it just really highlights the amount of, like, I would stretch myself so thin without my Design Ops partners. Also just having that sounding board of, you know, is this the right priority? What do you think? Well, you've been in the room with all the different priorities. You've seen all the other projects that are coming up. You're starting to, they're almost like synthesizing everything and saying, hey, we're seeing a lot of this happening over here. I think your team should prioritize these efforts. It's really just scaling the amount of work that anyone on the design team is able to do. I also look at the ways that they're able to create processes around the way that we work. Was in a meeting this morning with a Design Ops partner about what's our onboarding process. How do we create more of a process to it? How do we actually bring in the right information at the right time? And it's all the things that I know whenever I experience it, I'm like, this is painful. And I don't want to have to do it alone because it's just too much work to do alone. But when you've got the entire design org who has the same pain points and wants to solve it together, and then you have that person who's dedicated to helping you solve the problem, it makes the problem feel a lot smaller and a lot more attainable. And I just could go on and on about how much Design Ops really does help our entire organization move forward and just keep us on track, really.
I love that.
So we don't have a design ops team where I am. What would be the best way to kind of approach this topic within an organization to even establish this type of role?
I would say look within the team members and see who is actually really interested in doing more of these operation type of work. A design ops person is different from a designer, but benefits huge deal from being a designer coming from this background. That's why everything Kendall mentioned, everything you mentioned is like, oh, that all apply. I can relate. I was a designer. I came from that background. Design ops person doesn't have to be a designer, but I definitely benefit from that human-centered design approach, everything to solve the design operations challenges. So look within the team. I would look within the team, see who is interested in doing this kind of a work, and they start to do more of the work, tell the story, and then see eventually if you have enough needs to really carve out a dedicated role. One of my slides when I was talking about it, if you look at the state of design ops, many organizations, especially even the large enterprise, the design ops team is very small comparatively speaking. It's a team of one, and proportional wise, I talk about one design ops person for 10 design practitioners ideal, but in reality, I know many design ops team of one are supporting much larger team, 50, 100, 200. I've seen all of those. So a lot of organizations. That sounds stressful. Exactly. That's why prioritization is important. And that's why a lot of organizations don't have a dedicated design ops person, but there's always something we'll be interested in doing the work.
Good deal. Have you ever seen anyone within or worked within someone inside DevOps that was actually embedded with the design systems team?
So larger company do have design ops embedded in, say, a design system. Example I can think of, Salesforce and Adobe, they all have, when I talk about different kind of design ops, there's a product ops. They are embedded on the product team. I would see design system as one of the products, and they would have a dedicated, if team is large enough, they will have a dedicated design ops person.
Okay, good deal.
And one of the things that I see, like, there's that kind of boomerang effect with organizations of throw out all centralized, now let's centralize again. And one of the concerns that I would have is the PMO of old, where it was this centralized team that told people how to do things, and they became the gate checker, and they were saying, oh, you didn't do this, and give you a slap on the wrist and things like that. So how do you avoid design ops becoming that kind of almost a blocker instead of an enabler?
Yeah, so that is a really good choice of words, blocker versus enabler. And I see the role for design ops. I partnership closely with our PMO group and everyone, all the ops team. And I came from a design background. So again, human-centered design approach is how we approach design operation. If you talk about many design operations practitioners, we're focused on the people's need, not the process per se. We improve process, but not process-y for process. It's just a tool in a way. So we actually really care about what the people needs are, and we are the enablers rather than the blockers. And then we iterate, and I throw out there a lot of different ideas. They don't always work. And we try it out. They don't always work for real. And then I let our people tell me, it's like, let's work it out. If it doesn't work, tell me, let's make it to work for us. So that's the important thing. Help our team find out what works for us, not just propose a process.
I loved in your talk how you called that like experimenting, and just the subtle change in language around that it's not changing something, but it's experimenting. It almost brings a little bit more like openness to it. Because we face the same thing. I mean, every time you come up against a problem, you can say, well, we've done it this way a whole bunch and the problem is still here, so we should change it, but no one likes change. And there's something fun about, well, let's experiment with it. So I really love that framing in your talk.
Yeah, we like to refer to, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, even if it's a change management, but change is a scary word, and the experiment is a fun word.
Yes, it is. Yeah, we'll call them spikes, and spikes are meant to be experimental, but it is definitely aimed at, trying to figure out a way to affect change on a particular UI element or workflow with inside the application. And then every now and then we'll also call them hacks as well, because everybody likes to hack. That's when you just get over in there, throw everything at it and break it and be like, yeah. And then you come back and be like, so what'd you learn? Be like, I have no idea, but we broke everything. It was amazing.
Yeah, it's definitely the spirit of it, right? So build something, test it out, see if it works, test it, and iterate. So it's really product design principles, and that's what we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we run into that too with when we're working with really complex solves for accessibility. If we were building everything just straight out the gate with just raw HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, no problem. But in this day and age with single page apps, and then even with us designing custom widgets and things like that, a lot of those things, they're not native to the web. We are creating them. And, where tests show that someone may navigate it this particular way, we'll get a customer come back and be like, yeah, I couldn't use this because I do X, Y, and Z. I'm like, huh? How did you even find that? And then we'll have to go back and we iterate through to see if we can figure out different solutions that still work for this particular person who is navigating in another way, while still not negatively impacting everyone else who was using it, the way that we thought they would. And yeah, that part gets fun because, like I tell people all the time, accessibility doesn't have a silver bullet. What the solution you use over here may not be the viable solution that you use, here. You have to test and you have to iterate. And like I said, break things.
Yeah, that's so true for a lot of things that we do as well. I saw Catherine in the chat putting in, it's not one size fits all, right? So that applies to accessibility, applies to design operation as well. And that I heard part of Kendall, your talk, you were talking about, you have this whole design the exercise, but you find people can't do it, and then you have to do it for them on the fly. So you can't move it, I will move it for you. You have to be able to adjust, and there's no one size fits all. There's always variables, or line of work.
So, Kendall, for you, when you noticed that people were actually designing or building or expecting the same type of UI that you were already envisioning, how did that make you feel? Did it validate your ideas and give you at least some hope to make you feel like, yeah, we're on the right track, or was it a little bit deeper than that?
A little bit of both. It was a little bit, I think that there's a lot of different ways you can sometimes react to research insights. If I do a study and find out that it's exactly what our assumptions were, fantastic. We were on the right track. That's great. We now know that we were on the right track. If it's completely opposite of our assumptions, fantastic. We were wrong. We know that we're wrong.
We broke something.
So it's hard to ever get disappointed, I guess, in the research insights, because I feel like there's always, my take on it is there's always something to be learned. And so I will say that the designs that they created still had some things that were unique. And what we were really getting at, I know that the entire study was around the designs, but it was really, for me and for the team, more than the designs. It was what went into it. What was the rationale? And that was the piece of the puzzle that we didn't have, because we knew what they were using, but we didn't know why it mattered to them, why it was important, why if we move something around, what impact was that going to have? We learned there are some things, don't touch them, don't move it. It's gonna be bad. Other things we have a little bit of flexibility for. And so it kind of opened up, the designs were the same, if not very similar, but now we know why what we created in the first place was working. And so any adjustments we make down the road, we know why we should keep certain things and where we actually have that flexibility to kind of mix it up a little bit.
Yeah. The important part of that is being able to capture that information and remember it down the line, so that when this whole project circles back again, because I've seen that happen before. So it's like you make a decision, time passes, it's like, oh yeah, why did we do this? Well, let's change that. And be like, no, that actually works. But if that all gets lost, you end up making people angry.
We were in
something.
It couldn't be more timely that you bring that up. I today was realizing like, wow, obviously this is very top of mind for me. I just had to talk about it. I'm very aware of the research. It's something that we're still referencing kind of lightly in conversation, but I realized like, I think it's time to resurface this. I think it's time to just share the deck again. And I actually ended up creating, there were a couple of different research efforts that we did that were all somewhat connected, and we were talking around the same things. And I've had a couple meetings the last few weeks that just felt like we were going in circles. We're talking about the same thing over and over, same topic of discussion. Yeah. And so I just went through all my different research studies that I was aware of, and I just pulled the slides that I thought were most important for the team. Because I know it's overwhelming to send a deck and be like, just look at it. It's 30 pages, no big deal. I know you've got tons of time on your hands. So I only pulled the slides that I thought were actually important, but I pulled them all together into a single deck so that it was like, you can see the common thread through all of these different efforts. And it gained a lot of traction because I think it was in a way that the team was ready to revisit the insights, but it was telling the story the way that they needed it to be told at this point in the project. So it's tough. I think it's one of the hardest things for researchers is, you always fear that your research is going to live on that proverbial shelf and never get looked at again. And so I think it's our responsibility to continuously surface it so that we come back to the rationale of why did we make this decision. Also have to be open, though, that times change, technology changes, user behavior changes. And so the insights that we had 2 years ago, they may not be relevant anymore. And so it's recognizing when do you, stick to what you've learned and when do you say, maybe we should dig in again and see if this is still the case.
Yeah, I remember something along those lines. How you said what was good then may not be good now. I remember working on an e-commerce app, and we had horizontal slides. And our users had no problem with the horizontal sliding. And that was also back around the time when everybody was worried about the fold. Don't go below the fold. Now it's people have no problem vertically scrolling, but if you throw anything with horizontal in there, and they're ready to just like trash your app on Twitter and cancel you in the whole nine. So yeah, I felt that one.
Definitely iterative, right? So we learn and continue learning and continue iterate. The same thing for operations, the same thing. What works for 5 people's team won't work for 10 people, 30 people, 100 people. You just have to keep changing accordingly.
Yeah, that's true.
And see, so just on that research question, I find that fascinating as well. Like, how do you communicate and how do you give an end life to research? Do you have is there a separation in your world between kind of research ops and design ops? Are they the same thing? And if so, how do you tackle this problem of communicating your research?
That's a really interesting question because there is the title or the role as a research op, and there's a very specific needs for the research team. But again, that's even another level of luxury for an enterprise that you have to really have a huge team. First of all, you have to have a decent size of a research team to even dedicate a research ops person, but it's really all operations. There's no definitive cutoff line. I talked to Kendall. I would if I were the research ops person, I would go talk to Kendall and say, hey, let's talk about this. Is this the end life of this particular research? And we capture there. We leave it in some of our repository tools, and people might dig it out later. But the thing is that it's, again, a lot of work for designers is conversation. And then we iterate on it and then make an adjustment. There's no time. Design ops says, hey, we need to cut this off or anything. But as an ops person, part of the thing Kendall mentioned that is that I get to see different parts of the design organization. I see what the designers are doing, what the researchers are doing, what our managers are doing. So I connect the dots. So that's the role of the design operations person. We're the bridge, we're connecting dots. So we tell people, hey, Kendall, this research is really useful. This team could use it. Can you share with them? Or they have some other research, and I think this one might be obsolete. You two should talk. And that's the design operation and research operations role. Oh, you're on mute.
Yep, I was going to say absolutely, completely agree. And I think so we have a research ops team, but obviously the way that I love design ops, we could never have enough of them, because that's one thing that we struggle with, is kind of that end of life research. When is it truly done? We have a repository, but how do you maintain it? How do you keep it up? And that's something that I've been working on with a couple colleagues over the last year, is your repository is only good as it is up to date. And so how do we make sure that we're encouraging people to update it? How can we leverage our ResOps partners to help us make those connections and say, hey, I saw this person is doing this study. You did that study last year. Can you guys chat and see if you're not duplicating the same work? Because that's also frustrating. And so just having those folks that you can really communicate with and figure out, also, it's okay if you're doing duplicate work sometimes. I mean, you definitely want to make sure you're still having impact, but I've run studies that there was almost an exact parallel study run a couple of years ago, and the insights are the same. And it goes back to what I said before, like, awesome, that's great. Our assumption, nothing major has changed, business as usual, it's okay. If something major happened, awesome, great. We learned that something major happened, we can adjust. Like, it's really hard to have bad research, but it is so important to make sure that if you have a central repository, that it's up to date, or you have partners who can help connect those dots to make sure that the research is getting the visibility. Because if nobody knows it happened, a tree falls in the wood, no one hears it, if no one knows that the research happened, they can't actually action on it.
I'm always the one talking. I was going to say, I'm always the one reaching out to people, say, can you share this? Can you share this? Can you talk to people about this?
Is there anything on that discoverability side? Because I hear this all the time, that, as you said, your biggest fear is you do the research and it goes and it sits on the shelf over there and nobody references it. But a lot of times people don't know that the research exists. So how do you help with that discoverability? Do you have particular, is it a Word kind of document style approach? Is it graphical? How do you kind of structure it, and then how do you communicate it?
Yeah, so we have a dedicated repository that I think the research team knows about. So it's great for us. We have a tool, we can go and check ourselves, but we're not the target audience for this. It's hard. I think one of the ways that I've tried to tackle this is to be the squeaky wheel in the room. And so I attend, whenever possible, I'll try and attend our design crits. And if designers are showing work, that's maybe when I'll share, hey, we did some research around the same topic, let me send it to you. And if I can, create that space so that everybody knows that there was research on that topic, maybe that's the point that they reach out to me and say, do we have research on this other topic? I'll do the same thing in meetings. I'll just use the Zoom, chat feature and just be like, here's the research study, here you go. Like, while people are talking about it, just so that it fits also in context. That's a lot easier, is when it's contextually relevant. You're more interested to look at it, versus we also have a monthly newsletter that we send out, which is fantastic. We see spikes in our research report activity whenever we send out that newsletter, but it lacks that context and the contextual relevancy. And so it's really trying to figure out, it's better to have it out there than not at all. So figure out those ways, whether it's a repository or a newsletter, Slack channels, whatever that mechanism is, but then continuing to be the advocate for your own research, or the research that your teammates have done, and being the person to voice it and say, hey, this person actually is the one that led it. They can give you more information, but it kind of takes everyone together, constantly reminding each other that it exists. Because if no one's talking about it, that's when it's really dead on the shelf.
True indeed.
And is there any tips for, so instantly my head always comes to product. Like, how could you turn this into a product? Relying on people is a point of failure. So have you, because I agree at the moment, and that's how I've seen it in a lot of places, it does come down to the advocates constantly kind of jumping in and chiming in. But in my head, I'm trying to think team topologies. I don't know if you've read that, but you want to have X as a service, so people can self-service rather than relying on others. So is there anybody you've seen doing this well, or aware of anybody kind of really getting self-service research?
Well, I can say one thing that we did to, as I mentioned before, like having that repository, it's only as valuable as it is up to date. And one of the things we noticed is one of the teams in our org, we just didn't have any research from them. And I was like, I know you're doing research. I know, you guys must be busy. What's going on? And they had developed their own process for their own repository that was kept separate. And it worked for them. They had a process, it worked for them. They had a cadence, they were keeping it up to date, and they were sharing it with their stakeholders. But the issue that we saw was, I didn't know what was happening. I am sharing this tool with my, colleagues and connections. And if they didn't know that this research even existed, we're just back at the same place. And so at first we thought about, well, what if we just ask them to stop that and just use our tool? Nobody likes change. So instead we thought, well, they already have a thing, it's working for them. That's amazing. That's the hardest part, is to get that process going. We should not ask them to change. And we actually they were using a Google Sheets spreadsheet to basically capture all their information. The repository we have is a glorified Google Sheets with a better UI. And so we just built a script to bring the two of them together. And so it was one of those examples of meet people where they're at and figure out what they're already doing and just build into that. And so I think no matter what the tool is, no matter, there's a lot of companies that are doing repositories, and I know, mixed success, because again, it comes down to making sure that people are actively updating. And so the biggest thing we've been trying to figure out is, well, where is the best moment to introduce that? And so what we're going to experiment with this year is we send out these monthly newsletters. Maybe that's the right time to say, hey, you're already doing a quick summary of your research, post it here and here. It's just, one extra step, but it's already in that same process of what they're used to doing. So I think the biggest thing is just figuring out where people already are and build into their processes, and then figure out how to refine from there, and whether that's a tool or anything else. But the hardest part is getting people to change. And so maybe don't make them change.
Or slowly, gradually
is there
change.
Yes, yeah.
Is there a template issue as well? Like, how is there a template for writing research? Because it's kind of so different. So is there a standardized way you can do that?
You can make a template for anything. So we do, luckily, our ResOps team, amazing. They've created some templates for us that really help us get our research to at least look consistent. That's another thing of meeting people where they are. If your research looks totally different every single time a product manager looks at it, like, that's a learning curve that you're also adding to the mix. And so thinking about the ways that you introduce consistency and how you're communicating information. At one point in time, we did have a script that was built into that template. So a Google script that would scrape the template and pull the right information in. There does come a point when if you over automate everything, then you run into bugs and having to fix the bugs. And is it, actually meeting the goal you set out to achieve initially? And so it's an ever changing process. We're always looking at ways to optimize. I think the biggest thing though is less is enough. Like, I think we always aim for, like, we need to get all of this information in there. It's not valuable unless we have all of this. If we just had a link to the research report, that's enough, because that's more than we have today. And so really figuring out that right size of information, and start with good. Don't go for perfect or even great. Just start with good.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because when you were talking about how you were pulling in the data from this side and then your side, I'm like, how does that actually look? How does that come in if they're doing a different method than you guys? How does that even match up? But like you said, if you have a link, you can go, you can see, you don't have to worry about formatting and everything like that. That's good.
Yeah, we had to do a little bit of, Excel mapping or Google Sheets mapping to say, okay, this field, you call it this, we call it this. there's a bunch of fields that are empty. That's okay. We have space. It's all that matters. So.
And I'm sitting over here thinking, as I'm picturing this, I'm like, good grief, what does that cognitive load look like?
Oh, it's not pretty. It's not pretty. And that's a challenge in and of itself too, is, we also recognize that for it to be a tool that we want other people to use, it also needs to be usable. There's some irony in that we're creating this tool that's like not necessarily usable, and we're user experience researchers, and there's a lot that goes into culture change and organizational change. And again, that's where our design ops partners are incredible at helping us figure out like, what are those small experiments to run? This, honestly, our repository update has been basically a year-long experiment of constantly iterating and getting more feedback. But it is in a place where it's good enough. And I've had people reach out to me recently and say, hey, where can I find research? And I at least have a place to send them, because otherwise it was me searching through all the research I was aware of. But that's a huge gap. And that also means that that knowledge leaves every time somebody leaves the company. And so this is at least a place, not a beautiful place, but it exists, and it's a great place for us to start.
If there's any product people out there watching, this looks like an opportunity space that's ripe for disruption.
I am so fighting the urge to tell you what we do at the company that I work for, because we literally solve that problem. That's what our software does.
Ah, there you go. Lovely segue and plug. Check out Guru. But yeah, we're almost at the end. Is there any last question that anybody has, a burning question they want to ask one of the other participants? No? I'll ask one just randomly. What's everybody's opinion now of, like, because you touched on it, Kendall, of it's all remote. So now, are we going back to hybrid in-person research? Is it, what's the future?
I think we have to have some version of, from a researcher's perspective, and this is separate from me as an employee, because I definitely enjoy my morning commute down the stairs. But as a researcher, there's a lot, and you think about Uber especially. So I joined in April of 2020, fresh into the pandemic. I've only ever known remote research at Uber, but our product is so human. Our product is literally putting two strangers in a car together in a lot of cases. And so there's a lot about the actual experience that I just haven't been able to fully understand, aside from myself as a passenger. And so we have to look at some ways to make sure that we can get back to that in-person research, because there's a lot of nuance that we're missing. And without that, we are potentially creating products that aren't actually working for our users, because we're creating products that we think work for them as we're designing them at home, not in context. So there has to be a balance. One of the things I love about remote research is I do get to talk to people all over the world. And so I'm talking to people in rural cities that maybe if I was conducting research out of our office, they wouldn't come in because it's such a burden to actually reach them. And so there's plenty of pros and cons, but there's a lot of nuance that we're missing, that getting back into the world safely and conducting that in-person research is really going to help us close some of the gaps.
Excellent. Well, that's it for time for this conversation. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was a great kind of mix of jumping into all the different areas. So once again, just thank you to Homer, Z, and Kendall.
Thank you for having me.